Think for a moment. Imagine that everything you believe you know about the teachings of Jesus represents only the outer shell of a much deeper reality. Imagine that beneath the familiar sermons, parables, and moral instructions lies a sophisticated system of spiritual awakening, carefully encoded, deliberately concealed from casual understanding. Imagine that Jesus was not merely forming a religion, but transmitting a map of consciousness, a guide for inner transformation meant to be discovered only by those willing to look beyond appearances. And imagine that the final revelation we will reach later is the most powerful of all, capable of altering how you perceive life, the self, and the universe itself. From the very beginning, the message of Jesus has carried an air of mystery. He spoke in ways that unsettled authorities, confused literal minds, and yet deeply moved those with intuitive perception. This is why, across centuries, mystics, esoteric scholars, philosophers, and spiritual seekers have returned again and again to his words, sensing that something essential was hidden between the lines. These teachings resonate profoundly with those drawn to ancient wisdom, hermetic philosophy, the occult sciences of the soul, and the timeless truths transmitted quietly from generation to generation. If you have ever felt that the words of Jesus vibrate within you beyond logic, stirring something ancient and familiar, then you are already touching the threshold of these hidden teachings. Before we go further, take a moment to support this work. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share this video, and write your reflections in the comments. What will be revealed here has the potential to shift how you understand spirituality, faith, and your own inner power. To understand the secret side of Jesus' teachings, we must first understand how he taught. Jesus did not speak plainly to everyone. He chose parables, metaphors, symbols, and silence. Biblical scholar Joachim Jeremias emphasized that parables were not simple illustrative stories. They were deliberately crafted to divide listeners into two groups, those who heard only stories and those who perceived hidden meaning. Jesus himself confirmed this when he said that the mysteries of the kingdom were given to some, while others would hear without understanding. This aligns precisely with esoteric traditions worldwide, where sacred knowledge is not withheld, but revealed progressively according to inner readiness. This brings us to one of the most radical and misunderstood concepts in Jesus' message, the kingdom of God. Most people were taught to see it as a future place, a heavenly destination after death. Yet Jesus repeatedly stated that the kingdom is within you and among you. Historian and theologian Albert Schweitzer acknowledged that this teaching places Jesus firmly within the lineage of mystics rather than institutional theologians. The kingdom is not a location, it is a state of consciousness. It is the awakened awareness of divine reality operating through the human being. Notice how often Jesus speaks of perception rather than obedience. He emphasizes seeing, hearing, and understanding. In esoteric philosophy, these are not physical actions but inner faculties. To see is to perceive truth beyond illusion. To hear is to receive wisdom beyond words. To understand is to integrate truth at the level of being. The heart, in ancient spiritual traditions, is not merely emotional but the seat of spiritual intelligence. When Jesus speaks of hardened hearts, he is describing blocked consciousness. The Sermon on the Mount reveals this inner dimension with astonishing clarity. When Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God," he is not promising a reward in the future. He is describing a spiritual law operating now. Gershom Scholem, renowned scholar of Jewish mysticism, explained that purity of heart refers to inner alignment, the removal of fragmentation within the self. To see God is to perceive divine unity directly, not through belief, but through awakened awareness. Even the miracles of Jesus, so often reduced to supernatural spectacle, take on a different meaning when viewed through an esoteric lens. Healing the blind, the deaf, and the paralyzed symbolizes the awakening of dormant faculties within the soul. Carl Jung observed that religious symbols consistently point towards psychological and spiritual transformation. In this sense, Jesus' miracles are not just events to admire, but teachings encoded as narratives, pointing inward rather than outward. Ask yourself this question honestly. What if Jesus was not primarily asking to be worshipped, but inviting humanity to awaken? What if his most dangerous and revolutionary message was the discovery of the divine presence within the human being, And what if the teachings he reserved for those who were ready are far more transformative than anything commonly preached? As we continue, we will move deeper into the layers of symbolism, secrecy, and spiritual initiation embedded within his words, uncovering connections that many institutions preferred to overlook, and approaching a revelation that challenges the very foundations of how Jesus has been understood. Think deeper now. If the kingdom of God is within, then the teachings of Jesus are not about escape from the world, but about transformation within it. This is where many interpretations fail, because they look outward when Jesus consistently pointed inward. His message was not passive submission, but inner mastery. This idea unsettled religious authorities then, and it continues to unsettle systems of control today. One of the clearest windows into the secret side of Jesus' teachings appears in his relationship with knowledge itself. Jesus often warned against blind religiosity and empty repetition. He criticized those who followed laws without understanding their spirit. This mirrors the core principle of hermetic wisdom, which teaches that truth must be lived, not merely memorized. According to early Christian scholar Elaine Pagels, some of the earliest followers of Jesus understood his message as a path of inner knowing, or gnosis, rather than rigid belief. This understanding later became controversial because it empowered individuals to access divine truth directly, without intermediaries. Consider the phrase, "The truth shall set you free." Freedom here is not political or social alone. It is liberation from illusion, fear, and unconscious patterns. In esoteric traditions, truth is not information, but realization. To know the truth is to awaken from a state of inner sleep. Jesus frequently spoke of people as spiritually asleep, unaware of their own condition. His call was not simply to behave better, but to wake up. This brings us to the symbolism of light and darkness that permeates his teachings. Light, in mystical language, represents awareness. Darkness represents ignorance, not evil in a moral sense, but unconsciousness. When Jesus says that the light of the body is the eye, he is not speaking anatomically. He is referring to perception. When perception is clear, the whole being is illuminated. When perception is distorted, the inner world remains in shadow. Scholars of symbolism, including Joseph Campbell, emphasize that such language appears across all genuine spiritual traditions, always pointing toward inner awakening. Jesus also taught about dying before death, though this idea is rarely explored openly. He spoke of losing one's life in order to find it. On the surface, this sounds paradoxical. Esoterically, it refers to the death of the false self, the ego identity built on fear, attachment, and social conditioning. This concept aligns closely with mystical traditions studied by scholars such as William James, who observed that genuine spiritual transformation often involves a profound inner collapse followed by rebirth into a higher state of awareness. Notice how Jesus repeatedly distanced himself from rigid hierarchy. He told his followers that the greatest among them must be the servant of all. This was not merely ethical advice, but an inversion of ego-based power structures. In esoteric philosophy, the ego seeks domination, recognition, and control. Spiritual awakening dissolves this need. Authority arises from inner alignment, not external position. This is why Jesus posed such a threat to institutional power, both religious and political. Another overlooked aspect is Jesus' emphasis on secrecy itself. He often instructed those he healed not to speak openly about it. He withdrew from crowds. He explained teachings privately to his closest disciples. This pattern mirrors initiation traditions, where advanced knowledge is shared only when the student is prepared. The early Christian mystic Origen acknowledged that Christianity originally contained deeper teachings reserved for those capable of understanding them. Over time, many of these layers were simplified or suppressed. Reflect for a moment. Why would teachings meant to save humanity be layered, symbolic, and hidden? The answer lies in human psychology. Truth that arrives before readiness is either rejected or distorted. Jesus understood that consciousness evolves in stages. His parables functioned like mirrors, revealing understanding only to the degree the listener was capable of seeing. As we move forward, we will explore how these hidden teachings connect directly to ancient wisdom traditions that existed long before Christianity. and how Jesus consciously positioned himself within that timeless stream of knowledge. What we are approaching next challenges conventional religious narratives even more deeply and brings us closer to the most transformative insight of all. Now we move into territory that has been quietly avoided, debated, and often misunderstood for centuries. To grasp the secret side of Jesus' teachings, we must recognize that he did not emerge in a vacuum. His message did not appear suddenly, disconnected from the ancient wisdom traditions of humanity. On the contrary, his teachings echo principles found in Egyptian mystery schools, Jewish mysticism, Greek philosophy, and hermetic doctrine. This does not diminish his message, it magnifies it. Scholars such as Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary of Jesus, wrote extensively about the Logos, the divine rational principle that orders the universe and dwells within the human soul. When the Gospel of John opens by declaring that the Logos became flesh, it is making a profoundly esoteric statement. This is not merely about a historical event, it is about the embodiment of divine consciousness within humanity. Jesus represents the awakened human, the living bridge between the infinite and the individual. This idea aligns perfectly with hermetic wisdom, particularly the principle that what is above is like what is below, and what is within mirrors what is beyond. Jesus constantly reflected this law. He spoke of the Father and the Son as one, not as a claim of exclusivity, but as a demonstration of unity consciousness. When he says that those who see him see the Father, he is revealing a state of being, not demanding blind allegiance. Consider his statement, "You are gods and all of you are children of the Most High." This quotation, drawn from ancient scripture, was deeply unsettling to religious authorities. Why? Because it shattered the idea of spiritual separation. It implied that divinity is not distant, reserved, or external, but inherent. Historian Elaine Pagels explains that early mystical Christians understood salvation not as rescue from sin alone, but as awakening to divine identity. This awakening is symbolized repeatedly through the language of birth. Jesus speaks of being born again, a phrase often reduced to moral conversion. Yet in mystical traditions, rebirth refers to a shift in consciousness. It is the emergence of a new mode of perception. The old self, bound by fear and illusion, gives way to a self aligned with truth. This inner rebirth was the central aim of ancient initiation rites, a fact documented by scholars such as Mircea Eliade. Jesus' confrontation with the religious elite also takes on new meaning when seen through this lens. He accused them not of ignorance, but of blindness. They possessed knowledge, but lacked insight. They memorized laws, but missed their living essence. This distinction between knowledge and wisdom is central to esoteric philosophy. Knowledge accumulates, wisdom transforms. Jesus consistently sided with transformation. Even the crucifixion carries a symbolic dimension often overlooked. Beyond historical reality, it represents the ultimate surrender of ego identity. The willing acceptance of suffering without hatred reflects mastery over fear and attachment. Carl Jung viewed the crucifixion as an archetype of individuation, the moment when the divided self confronts its shadow and transcends it through conscious sacrifice. Notice also the silence of Jesus during critical moments. Silence, in mystical traditions, is not absence but presence. It signifies a level of awareness beyond argument, beyond defense. This silence communicates more than words ever could. It teaches that truth does not need to prove itself. It reveals itself. As we approach the final phase of this journey, everything begins to converge. The parables, the secrecy, the inner kingdom, the call to awakening, the declaration of inner divinity, all point toward a single transformative realization. What remains is the teaching that ties them all together, the one Jesus hinted at repeatedly, yet few dare to fully embrace. Now we arrive at the heart of everything that has been hinted at, concealed, and quietly transmitted through the words of Jesus. This is the teaching that unifies all the others, the one that gives them meaning, coherence, and transformative power. It is also the teaching that has been most diluted, misunderstood, or avoided, precisely because of how radically it alters the way human beings see themselves and reality. At the core of the secret side of Jesus' teachings is this realization. Transformation does not come from external salvation, but from inner awakening. Jesus consistently pointed away from dependency and toward direct experience, He did not teach that the divine must be reached through intermediaries, rituals, or institutions. He taught that the divine is encountered through inner alignment, awareness, and lived truth. This is why he emphasized faith not as belief but as trust in an unseen inner reality. Faith, in this sense, is not passive acceptance, but active attunement. This is also why love stands at the center of his message. Love, as Jesus taught it, is not sentimental emotion. It is a state of being. It is the natural expression of awakened consciousness. When the illusion of separation dissolves, compassion arises spontaneously. Loving your neighbor as yourself is not a moral command imposed from outside. It is a description of perception when one recognizes the same divine essence in all beings. Philosopher Baruch Spinoza later echoed this idea when he described love as the intellectual recognition of unity. Jesus' command to love even one's enemies becomes intelligible only at this level. From an ego perspective, it seems impossible. From an awakened perspective, it is inevitable. The enemy is seen not as other, but as another expression of the same consciousness, distorted by fear and ignorance. This does not excuse harm, but it transcends hatred. It is mastery over reaction. It is freedom. This brings us to the final and most powerful revelation hinted at throughout Jesus' teachings, the realization of unity consciousness. When Jesus prayed that all may be one, as he and the Father are one, he was articulating the ultimate goal of spiritual awakening. Unity does not erase individuality. It transcends fragmentation. It reveals that beneath all forms, roles, and identities, there is a single living presence expressing itself in countless ways. Mystics across cultures have arrived at this same realization. Meister Eckhart spoke of the divine ground within the soul. The Sufi poet Rumi described the lover and the beloved as one. Eastern sages taught that the self and the absolute are not two. Jesus stands firmly within this universal current of wisdom, not as an exception, but as a clear expression of what awakened humanity looks like. This understanding reframes salvation entirely. Salvation is not escape from the world, but awakening within it. It is the shift from fear to love, from separation to unity, from unconscious living to conscious participation in the divine flow of life. The cross, then, is not merely an object of worship, but a symbol of the intersection between the human and the divine, the horizontal world of form and the vertical dimension of spirit, united in awareness. The resurrection, likewise, is not only about life after death. It is about life after awakening. It symbolizes the emergence of a new mode of being that transcends fear, even in the face of death. William James described such states as spiritual rebirths, where the individual no longer lives from the surface of the self, but from its deepest center. Now the question returns to you. If the kingdom is within, if truth liberates through realization, if love is the expression of unity, then what remains to be done is not to wait, but to awaken. Jesus did not come to be admired from a distance. He came to be understood, embodied, and lived. So ask yourself, not as a believer, but as a seeker of truth, what would change in your life if you took these teachings seriously at the level of experience? What illusions would fall away? What fears would lose their grip? And what kind of world could emerge if enough people awakened to the same inner truth? The secret side of Jesus' teachings was never meant to remain secret forever. It was meant to be discovered by those ready to see, hear, and understand. And perhaps the fact that you are here, reflecting on these words, is not an accident, but an invitation. The invitation is simple, yet profound. Wake up to what has always been within you. Pause for a moment and allow this final reflection to settle more deeply. Throughout the teachings of Jesus, there is a recurring invitation that goes beyond words, doctrines, or belief systems. It is an invitation to experience reality directly, without filters imposed by fear, conditioning, or inherited interpretations. This is why his message continues to feel alive, unsettling, and strangely familiar, even after centuries have passed. When Jesus said, "Seek and you shall find," he was not pointing toward an external search. He was pointing toward an inner journey. Seeking in this sense is not accumulation of knowledge, but the willingness to question everything that separates you from truth. It is the courage to look honestly at the self, to confront illusion, and to allow transformation to occur from within. Many mystics agree that this inner seeking is the most demanding path, because it requires responsibility rather than reliance. This also explains why fear plays such a central role in human experience and why Jesus addressed it so directly. Fear sustains separation. Fear creates the illusion of isolation. Again and again, Jesus encouraged trust, surrender, and inner peace. Do not be afraid was not merely comfort, but instruction. A mind governed by fear cannot perceive truth clearly. A heart anchored in trust becomes receptive to divine awareness. In this light, prayer itself takes on a new meaning. Prayer is not begging or pleading. It is alignment. It is the quiet attunement of consciousness with its source. When Jesus withdrew to pray in silence, he demonstrated that communion with the divine happens in stillness, not noise. Modern thinkers such as Thomas Merton recognized that this contemplative dimension was central to Jesus' inner life and message. Perhaps the most profound implication of all is this: if these teachings are lived rather than admired, they naturally reshape how one moves through the world. Compassion replaces judgment. Presence replaces distraction. Meaning replaces emptiness. This is not an escape from human life, but its fulfillment. And so the question remains open, intentionally unanswered. Will these teachings remain concepts, or will they become lived experience? The secret side of Jesus' teachings does not demand belief. It invites realization. And realization, once glimpsed, quietly changes everything. Thanks for looking.